I'm Tanja K. Johnson, and this is Voices of Color, a writing podcast.
Episode 3, Story Structure.
I am Victoria Wilder, author of the upcoming novel Lullaby of the Lilith-Hue.
This is Marion Jones, author of the Golden Feather Saga.
This is Ellen Bennett, author of The Accidental Sunday.
Hello, this is Voices of Color, a writing podcast. And in today's episode, we're going to discuss story structure. We talked briefly about it last week, so we wanted to dive a little deeper. What kind of story structure do you guys use for your novels?
Well, I actually don't tend to look at any specific structure when I'm writing my novels, but when I was really learning about structure, I found a book called Plot and Structure. And so it does use ideas like the 3-act structure and things like that, and I kind of took those ideas and work it in with my own structural way to do things, but I don't really subscribe to any one structure.
Okay. So you don't believe in using like a beginning, middle, end, like 3-act structure kind of sequence?
Not really. Like, I do believe obviously that every story has a beginning, middle, and end, but as I'm writing it and as I'm plotting it out, I don't think of it in those terms. It's just, this is what happens, and this is what has to happen next, and this is what has to happen next to get me to this other point that I've already plotted out that I know needs to happen.
I usually break my stories down into 8 parts or 8 things to focus on. And I try to stick to it since most of the successful stories pretty much have the same things.
Can I ask what the 8 things are?
The setting, the characters, the problem or goal for the main character, how the main character engages, the escalation, because you have to beat your main character up, so you have to have more obstacles. Then the lose, is the big fail, which most people would give up. And then the win, how the main character solves the problem, which is the climax. And then there's the cool down. Some stories don't have a cool down. As soon as the climax is over, the story's over. But some stories have a cool down. I try to put that in my stories.
Nice. Yeah, I do think like all the major successful stories definitely have those. Even when I write, I don't think about those things, but I definitely try to remember that those are all very important to make a good story enjoyable.
And I think about it from a character point of view. Like, I start with my character. I figure out what it is that they want, what is keeping them from getting what they want, who is in the way of them getting what they want, what they're going to do to achieve their goal, and then what happens next. I don't write novels, I write short stories, so I tend to structure it, I guess, a bit more compactly, and I don't think long-term character arcs, which are vital, like when you're telling longer stories.
Yeah, you definitely have a lot more leeway structure-wise when you're writing short stories as compared to, a full-length novel.
I'm just learning that now. I've never written short stories. So now that I'm working on 2 anthologies, I have to focus on a shorter kind of setup instead of the whole 8-point that I'm usually used to writing.
Short stories are very different. I write both short and novels, and it's like you kind of have to change the way your brain thinks about the story when you're doing shorter pieces, because you can't have all these underlying subplots and all these extra things that we like to put in our novels. You have to be very, or at least for me, I have to be very precise in what's happening in this story, and then it's a lot more structured, I think, than my novel writing is. I think when I was starting out, I was really into the hero's journey. I've never successfully written a story with that structure, but I've always been fascinated, and I'm thinking of writing a children's story with that structure because it is really good. It's really simple. I don't want to say simple, but it's very useful to like just say this has to happen at this point in the story, and this is what your hero is going through. And there's like, it's the story I have in mind is the perfect fit for the hero's journey. So I do want to try that out, but I haven't yet.
I noticed that when you're writing a full length story, you have to have your secondary characters and their goals and how they may become bigger parts in the next book if you're working on a series. But in the short story structure, you really don't focus too much on secondary characters.
You don't. They're there to serve a specific purpose. Sometimes as a sounding board to the main character, but then you have to consider whether or not they have their own agenda, what it is that they're doing, and what part that plays in your story, with your character.
That's where I have issues with short stories. I always feel like my secondary characters might fall a little flat because I'm trying to round them out too much as it's taking away from the main character in a way.
It's definitely not easy for me to do it that way because you kind of feel like everybody has to have a purpose.
That's an issue I think I've had too with secondary characters. It's like I want to give you this whole background and this whole life, but like I only have 5,000 words and I have to focus on this story.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have used structure in your stories, have you guys experimented with different types? I know there's the save the cat method, the beat method, and the classic 3-act structure method. Which of those have you guys tried, and what do you think about each one of those?
Probably spent more time with the beat method, and I don't think I'm doing it right. But I like the idea of having beat by beat. That's I guess kind of what I was saying earlier is this is this beat and this is the next thing and the next thing, and then I can go in and add what happens in between each beat. So I do tend to work with that and again try to make it work for my brain.
I haven't had that much experience yet on the various structures. I kind of focus on what each story needs to have in it and try to just make sure I connect those dots. Like make sure that the main character has his levels, the secondary character has theirs. Make sure there's a goal, there's a finish line, like a map. And I just try to make sure every point is touched.
If you don't follow structure, how do you know which of those points or beats that you need to hit and when you need to hit them to make sure the story is resonating with the readers?
Well, I basically I think about the goal of the main character, what they have to achieve to get to that goal, the obstacles that they're going to hit before they get it, and there's got to be a point or two where they feel like giving up. And if there's a love interest, that complicates things a little bit more. But I know that now they have two goals: a goal to gain or keep that love interest, and then the goal of getting whatever else they want. And then I know that every main character has to have weaknesses and strengths. So I make sure that they have those. Like there's no good character should be just all strong. There should be something wrong about them. The same thing about a bad character. A bad character has to have some streak of goodness in their life that maybe they lost and that changed them bad. But you have to have different levels to the characters in order for people to like them. So that's what I try to focus on when it comes to the characters.
Are you more like when you write, it's about like the character's journeys and that's how you are able to hit those emotional spots? You feel how they're feeling.
Yes.
I kind of do something similar. Like it's really, I think characters for me are one of the most important part of the story, and I'd love to talk about that later. Just what their experience is supposed to be towards the end. And quite often when I'm writing, I know what the end should be. And that's kind of how I'm able to guide my story there. And then I really like to look at how the characters are feeling through their experience, and what they're feeling kind of guides me to what they should be experiencing next. And that's just kind of how I figure out what's going to happen next and what needs to happen as it goes on.
That is a perfect place for us to take a short break. And V, why don't you tell us a bit about your novel that's coming out soon?
Sure. Lullaby of the Lilichu is a dark fantasy, urban fantasy novel about a young woman who wakes up as a supernatural being. She wakes up and has no memory of her life before being this supernatural being, and she's a part of a family of these people, and they basically tell her that, you know, we're gods. We are the gods of man. And she has to learn to accept it. But over time, things aren't looking as good as it started out. And she's starting to question her father, particularly the one who created her, and all of his rules. And then as she's questioning this, some of her memories from before are coming back, and they're not pleasant. And as she's dealing with this, someone from her father's past has returned and is basically pissed off and wants to destroy her father's life. And that includes the young woman, Rio. So she's got to face all of this and figure out who she is in the midst of this horrible experience.
Wow, that sounds really good. I can't wait for this book to be released. So where did you get your inspiration from?
A dream, actually. Like I had this weird dream. I don't know if you've seen the Wesley Snipes movie Blade, but
Yes.
it was him in my dream. And he became the father in this book, and it's entirely different. But in my dream, it was basically a young woman was looking for Blade, and he was missing, and she couldn't figure out how to exist without him. And so it was such a desperate emotion, a desperate need to find him, to find her father. And I guess that just kind of blossomed into this whole story about, essentially, even though it's fantasy and they're not human, it's essentially a story about a family and how a father figure has affected this young woman.
I bet everybody listening now wants to go out and buy your book immediately.
Oh yeah.
It'll be out in May.
Okay, let's jump back into discussion. So we've been talking a little bit about how everybody has their own process, that structure is not really that structured. So every story, do you think it does need a structure? Like we said, short stories, you can kind of pants them a little bit, I guess, or go by the seat of your pants. So with novels, do you think it's possible to write it completely without having any structure at all in mind?
I think you could do that for the first draft, for sure. Like lots of people do.
For the first draft, and that's it.
I think if as long as you're hitting all the right beats or the right topics, you should be good to go. That you can't skip out on making sure the setting is believable. You can't skip out on the main character having a goal or what pushes them to pursue it. So there's certain things you just have to have, or else it wouldn't make sense.
To make a story, I think for me to enjoy a story, it does have to have things that matter. It has to be rooted in some sort of concrete imagery and needs that I can support, that the character, well, I don't have to support it, but like I have to believe that the character needs something and that their actions are either to help them achieve it or they are alternatively in detriment, and they have to figure out how to stop harming themselves in that way. And I think if you have these basic things like a basic need and a good setting and all that stuff, then you can eventually rework your story. You know, that's why I said just in the first draft, you can have whatever you want. And then when you go back, then you can look at it for what is structured and what might sell and what other readers might want. But at the beginning, if you have those basic elements, then you already have a pretty good story, I think. I think it has to matter. Like what's happening in the story has to matter from beginning to end.
That's really good advice. It has to matter. Every point you're making in the story has to matter towards that final goal. So when you guys read, do you notice a pattern in books that you believe are structured versus in books that aren't?
if the structure is off, I don't continue. I kind of feel like when the story kind of devolves into it stalls, or it just kind of sort of devolves into the character just like kind of sort of being in their feelings, not really doing anything to move the story forward, conversations that go nowhere, or things that happen that I don't necessarily like, or I don't necessarily understand. Like it turns me way off, and then I don't continue. I just can't, because I kind of feel like it kind of shows that the writer isn't mature a little bit, and maybe if they didn't study it, like they kind of went their own way, and maybe they could have benefited from an editor that could have reined them in a little bit.
I definitely agree on all of those points, 100%. For me, a lot of problems I see in books are what we writers call the saggy middle, or the soggy middle, where you have all this really wonderful stuff happening in the beginning and the end is excellent, but the middle is kind of meandering. You don't really know what's happening. It's just a bunch of sticky stuff hold the beginning and the middle together. So how do we avoid this with structure? That's why I think structure is so beneficial for writers to learn and to study, so we can avoid these kinds of pitfalls. So what are your tips that you guys have that we can give our listeners to avoid this kind of soggy middle?
Well, like I said a minute ago, everything has to matter, and that's not just the overall things. Like dialogue has to matter. Like I don't want to hear how your day was if it's not affecting the story. If you're a lot of the times in books that I don't love, they'll have two characters talking about something they both already know, just as exposition, and that I think doesn't help anybody. Like if you're going to reveal new information, do something that makes someone react, because if someone reacts, then there's a change. And I think if change is constant, then it's always moving forward. And if you're stuck in a place where the characters are kind of just sitting in a room talking about something they both know about, and then once they leave that room, that conversation has no purpose and hasn't changed anything, then you have a problem.
I agree, and it's definitely about finding out what we mentioned before: the character's weaknesses, the character's needs, and interweaving those into the plot. Like sometimes in the most uncomfortable ways for your character to continue to move the story forward, so you can continue to root for them, and you don't have such a soggy middle, because then you have a character that is either actively working towards or is working against their own interests, which keeps the story going towards the appropriate conclusion.
I totally agree.
I agree with all of your tips. I'm actually in transition. I started off just inspired with a story, and so I fleshed it out. And now, as the more I write, the more I study about acting, because I want to go from a storyteller to a full-time writer. So as I'm writing, I'm continually learning and learning and learning, and adding more tools to the belt. So whereas I didn't focus too much on certain structures in the first book that I worked in my series, I'm learning about different things in the second book that kind of wish I knew in the first book. But I think there is an importance of structure, because if you don't have certain things, you will have those weak points. And that's what I'm fighting against. I'm trying to make sure everything makes sense and everything is working towards a bigger goal. Because even when I think I have everything down, somebody will say, "Is that part important? Do you really need that?" And so I think about it, but now you're right. I don't need that. So it's all part of the learning process. Every book should be better than your last.
Yeah, absolutely. I like what you said about learning. I think that's another really, really good tip. Never stop learning, because there's always something new. I mean, there's the possibility that people take that too far and they use everything they learn at once. But I think the point of learning all these things is so that you can, like you said, add to your tool belt, and you can pick and choose how to make things work and how to make things, how to tweak them and make them a little bit different to work for you. But if you don't know those ideas and those rules, then you're not going to really know how to properly break them so that it's still enjoyable. So I think always keep learning. If you're a writer out there and you think that you've learned everything, then I guarantee you haven't.
Yes. So speaking of tool belt, which was an excellent idea, what is in your tool belt as far as structure?
My favorite book as far as tool belt, story, structure, character, all of those things is The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. It kind of lays everything out for you. It's meant specifically for people who are screenwriters, but those tips are easily adaptable to fiction. I was reading another book, which I'm not going to name, that just kind of has this whole complex system as far as where you're supposed to hit certain points, and I just completely tuned it out. But I think John Truby, like, he more or less puts it in black and white terms and sort of gives you the tools to hit the ground running and tell a nice, strong story from start to finish that hits all of the emotional beats that you're supposed to hit, and let your character do all of the heavy lifting and the story. Like, it kind of weaves it in so tight that the reader has no choice but to walk away knowing that they read a great story. So to me, like, that's the biggest part of my toolbox.
That is high praise, and I definitely have to second that book choice. Another great one that I believe is Structuring Your Novel by K.M. Weiland. Has anybody read that?
I've read her website a lot. She's amazing.
Yes, she has some really great resources on her blog. She's also on YouTube. You can find her all over the web. Yeah, so basically her book does exactly what any good structuring book does, and it tells you how to complete your book from beginning to end so that it resonates with your readers.
What's her name?
K.M. Weiland.
Cam Weiland.
Yeah, she's just such a useful tool. I think every author should check her out. And there's also Joanna Penn, who does a podcast as well, and she's got a bunch of amazing books out for being a productive and a healthy writer. And her podcasts, I think, were a big part of how I was able to finish Lullaby of the Lilitude, because she's very clear, and like she doesn't BS you, you know. She's like, it's not easy, but this is what you can do, and this is how I did it, and how success has come for me. And she's very successful where she lives right now, over in Europe, I believe. Plot and Structure by James Scott Bell is also probably an essential book for me. Like, it is another thing that helped me really figure out, because it took like almost 7 years to finish Lullaby, because I didn't know anything about plot and structure, not even a little. And not knowing that, I just kept getting stuck and kept getting stumped. And this book changed that experience for me really fast. I think it's from his Write Great Fiction series.
Yes, I believe you are right. Okay, so I think that's gonna wrap up the time that we have today. I have a bit of homework for our listeners. Take a piece that you're writing, anything that you have, and look for the structure. What are you doing structure-wise? What aren't you doing structure-wise? Examine this piece and tighten it up so that it can be the most well-rounded story that it can be. Any closing comments from our panel?
I think that is great advice. I'm going to take that advice as well.
I was just thinking that, like, I'm going to do that.
All right, good. This has been Voices of Color. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode.